In August 1943, Allied escorts in the Bay of Biscay looked up and saw something they didn't have a playbook for: a German bomber releasing a weapon that didn't fall like a bomb. It glided, then corrected its course, then kept coming. A single hit could erase months of convoy work, reopen submarine lanes, and force entire naval groups to back away from critical patrol zones. But the real danger wasn't just that Germany had a smart bomb. It was that the Allies didn't yet know what part of the system to attack: the missile, the bomber, or the invisible radio link between them. And in the weeks that followed, the war at sea briefly turned into a different kind of contest. One fought with antennas, procedures, and seconds. By mid-1943, the Atlantic and the Mediterranean were both balancing on logistics. Merchant shipping wasn't just support, it was the war's bloodstream. Troops, fuel, ammunition, aircraft parts, landing craft, everything moved by sea until it didn't. And whenever that flow slowed, strategy shrank. That's why the idea behind Germany's HS-293 mattered. It wasn't designed to win a dogfight or flatten a city. It was built to solve a specific, costly problem: hitting moving ships protected by anti-aircraft guns and escorts. The basic concept was brutally practical. A bomber could release the weapon from outside the heaviest flak. The missile would glide toward the target under the operator's control. It carried a substantial warhead, and because it approached low and fast, it threatened ships in the space where evasive maneuvers were hardest and reaction time was shortest. But here's the first twist: the HS-293 wasn't fire and forget. It was closer to launch and babysit. The bomber had to keep the target in view and guide the weapon all the way in. That meant every attack came with a built-in trade-off: precision in exchange for exposure. Still, in 1943, even that trade-off could look terrifying. The Allies had learned how to blunt some threats with armor, escorts, and radar. The HS-293 aimed at a different weakness: the moment a ship's defenses were overwhelmed not by volume of bombs, but by one accurately placed strike. To understand why it caused such alarm, you have to picture convoy defense as a layered routine. Escorts spread out to detect submarines. They maintained patrol patterns. They reacted to air contacts with standard drills: smoke, turns, concentrated fire, fighter direction if air cover was available. The HS-293 forced new questions into that routine. Do you hold formation, or brake hard and risk collisions? Do you keep firing at the bomber, or attempt to hit the incoming weapon? Do you generate smoke to hide, or does smoke make guidance easier by giving the operator a reference point? And most importantly, how do you defend against something you can't jam if you don't know its frequency, and can't outrun if you spot it too late? Rehook. The weapon's real strength wasn't only in its explosive. It was in the confusion it created, because confusion burns time, and time is the only thing a guided attack can't spare. Germany had been chasing guidance concepts for years, and by 1943 this particular design matured into a weapon that could be fielded in meaningful numbers. It was paired with aircraft that could carry it and crews trained to use it, bomber units tasked with anti-shipping strikes. Training mattered because guiding an HS-293 wasn't like dropping a bomb on a fixed target. It demanded steadiness, clear visibility, and discipline under fire. And the weapon itself was engineered for one job: reach ships that had learned to dodge conventional bombing. A glide weapon could be aimed, corrected, and walked onto a target, especially a large ship trying to turn in limited sea room. The first combat employment came in late August 1943 in the Bay of Biscay, where Allied groups were hunting U-boats and protecting the air-sea battle around the convoy routes. The bay wasn't an abstract map square. It was where escort groups tried to choke submarine access and where long-range aircraft battled for maritime control. In those first attacks, the novelty was not subtle. A ship could do everything right against standard bombing, guns firing, turns executed, smoke deployed, and still be struck by a weapon that appeared to ignore the usual geometry of an air attack. When a guided weapon sank a British escort in that period, it wasn't just a loss of one hull. It was a shock to the defensive system. The immediate consequence was operational. Patrol patterns and surface deployments were reconsidered. Ships pulled back from certain exposures until countermeasures could catch up. But here's the second twist. The Germans had not created a standalone miracle. They had created a system that required everything to work at once: launch aircraft surviving, the operator seeing the target, the guidance link staying clean, and the weapon itself functioning properly in salt air and turbulent weather. That system created its own Achilles heel. The HS-293's guidance method depended on a clear line-of-sight relationship: bomber, operator, missile, target. The operator needed to keep the weapon in view, often aided by a flare or tracer on the weapon, and fly it with corrections. That meant the bomber couldn't simply release and run. It had to loiter in the danger zone longer than a conventional bomb run might require. So the Allies started to think differently. The question shifted from, how do we stop the missile? To, how do we break the chain? Breaking the chain could happen in multiple places. Kill or drive off the bomber before launch. Obscure the operator's view so guidance becomes guesswork. Disrupt the radio control link so corrections don't translate into movement. Survive the hit. Reduce damage through tactics and design. Each option had problems. Fighter cover wasn't always available, especially over convoy routes and during bad weather. Obscuring visibility with smoke could be a double-edged sword. It could deny the operator a clear aim point, but it could also conceal the missile's approach until it was too late. Disrupting radio control required equipment, training, and time, and those were not evenly distributed across fleets in 1943. And surviving the hit depended on where it struck. A single guided weapon could target vital areas, machinery spaces, magazines, steering, rather than landing randomly. Rehook. In other words, this wasn't a simple arms race of new weapon, new armor. It was a race to identify the weakest link in a multi-step kill chain, before the shipping plan buckled. As news of guided bomb attacks spread, the fear wasn't only about sinkings already happened. It was about what could happen next. A guided weapon used at scale against invasion shipping, troop transports, and critical escorts in the Mediterranean. The timing mattered because 1943 wasn't a quiet year. Allied forces were moving into Italy, and the sea lanes around the Mediterranean became crowded with the exact kind of targets a precision anti-ship weapon was built for. But Germany also faced constraints. The HS-293 needed trained crews and suitable aircraft, and those aircraft were under increasing pressure. Allied air superiority was not total everywhere, but it was growing. Every bomber flying a guided weapon mission did so against improving radar coverage, fighter direction, and anti-aircraft fire. So Germany's early successes were significant, but fragile. This is the part most summaries miss. A guided weapon creates fear quickly, but it creates reliability slowly. Reliability requires repeated missions, consistent conditions, and steady supply. And those were exactly the things a contested air-sea environment denies. The Allies, meanwhile, were building an answer that didn't require perfect gunnery. They aimed at the weapon's invisible dependency, the guidance. Electronic warfare in World War II is often imagined as a late-war novelty. In reality, it was an evolving craft, and the appearance of radio-controlled bombs accelerated it. Countermeasures weren't just install box, problem solved. They had to find what to jam, how to jam it, and how to do so without interfering with their own communications. At sea, this had to be made practical. Escort ships needed procedures: when to activate jammers, how to coordinate with other vessels, how to avoid mutual interference, and what to do if the jammer failed or the enemy changed frequencies. At the same time, air defense tactics adapted. If the bomber had to stay on course longer to guide the weapon, then forcing it to maneuver through fighters, flak patterns, or even ship turns could degrade guidance accuracy. Even small disruptions mattered, because a guided weapon is only as good as its last correction. Rehook. The more the Allies could force the bomber to fly like a hunted aircraft, the less the weapon behaved like a guided one. But nothing moved faster than events. In 1943 and early 1944, guided weapons threatened ships during major operations, and the Allies didn't always have the right tools in the right place. Some convoys had stronger air cover than others. Some areas had better electronic support than others. In that uneven transition period, the HS-293 could still bite. And it created a hard strategic dilemma. Do you accept temporary shipping losses while you develop countermeasures? Or do you pull forces back, reduce exposure, and risk giving the enemy operational breathing room? That dilemma appeared in microdecisions. Patrol groups altered their patterns, escorts stayed closer to protective fighter range, commanders weighed whether certain missions were worth the guided bomb risk. Then, slowly, a pattern began to emerge from the chaos. The HS-293 was dangerous, but it was predictable in what it required. Daylight or visibility windows, stable tracking, a bomber that could hold position, and a clean radio link. If you could deny one of those, the threat collapsed quickly. But here's the third twist. Denying those conditions at sea is never guaranteed. Weather is not a strategy. Visibility shifts. Fighter cover comes and goes. Jammers fail. And a convoy can't always choose where it must sail. So the Allies pushed for a layered answer, not a single silver bullet. Better air cover where possible. Improved AA coordination. More disciplined smoke and maneuver doctrine. And, most importantly, a rapid spread of electronic countermeasures once the threat was understood well enough to jam effectively. Mini cliffhanger, end of Module 1. By early 1944, the Allies had learned what the HS-293 needed to win, but Germany learned something too. If the radio link was the weakness, then the battlefield wasn't the ocean anymore. It was the electromagnetic space between bomber and missile. And the next phase of the fight would decide whether guided weapons were a brief scare or a lasting sea change. The HS-293 shocked Allied navies in late 1943 by proving a bomber could guide a weapon onto a moving ship outside the old flak patterns. But the weapon wasn't independent. It depended on a bomber staying steady, an operator seeing the target, and a radio link carrying every correction. That gave the Allies a new objective: break the chain. Now the stakes are clear. Either countermeasures spread fast enough to protect convoys and invasion shipping, or a small number of precision strikes could force entire sea lanes to operate under fear and delay. The escalation wasn't simply more missiles. It was a contest of adaptation. As the Allies absorbed the early attacks, they began treating guided bombs as a system problem, something to be countered with coordinated changes across air cover, ship tactics, and electronics. First came a shift in how ships behaved under air threat. Traditional anti-aircraft defense emphasized volume of fire against attackers diving into release. With guided weapons, the release point could be farther out, and the bomber might fly a different profile to maintain guidance. So watch routines changed. Engagement priorities changed. Some escorts trained crews to track the bomber as the primary target, because if the bomber had to break away, guidance quality suffered immediately. At the same time, commanders revisited smoke doctrine. Smoke could hide ships, but it could also create confusion inside a convoy and reduce mutual support if ships lost visual contact with each other. The answer wasn't always smoke or never smoke. It became conditional. Smoke early deny clean tracking, but not so indiscriminately that ships collided or escorts lost their assigned sectors. The best defense wasn't a single trick, it was timing. If the convoy reacted too late, a guided weapon had already solved the hardest part of its job. Now the major leap: electronic countermeasures. Jamming a radio-controlled weapon sounds straightforward in concept, but in practice it was a messy engineering and operational problem. The defenders needed to know what to jam, and the attacker could adjust frequencies, power, and procedures. Ships had limited space and power for new equipment. Crews needed training. And every jammer had to coexist with the ship's own radios, radar, and communications discipline. But once workable jamming sets and procedures began to spread, they targeted the HS-293's most delicate assumption, that the operator's corrections would reach the missile cleanly. If the link was disrupted, the missile did not become harmless, but it became less controllable. A weapon designed for precision could revert toward probability. And probability is what convoys were built to endure. Another layer of adaptation happened in the air. The bomber guiding the weapon was the hinge of the entire attack. Allied fighters and anti-aircraft fire didn't have to destroy every bomber. They had to force bombers to maneuver, break line of sight, or rush the guidance sequence. Any of those could turn an aimed strike into a miss. And this is where the HS-293's hidden limit became visible. The weapon demanded calm in a battle that was becoming less calm by the month. Allied air cover improved over key sea routes. Radar direction improved. Fighters were used more aggressively to push attackers away from the convoy before launch. Even when fighters didn't shoot down the bomber, they could force the bomber to abandon the ideal guidance profile. Once fighters entered the equation, the HS-293 stopped being only a weapons story, it became an air superiority story. Germany tried to keep the weapon relevant by moving units, refining tactics, and selecting targets where conditions favored guided attacks, areas with less fighter cover, or moments when surprise and weather could offer a window. But the strategic environment was collapsing around the launch platforms. Attrition of experienced crews mattered. Aircraft losses mattered. Fuel constraints mattered. And as Allied dominance increased in some theaters, the opportunities for a slow, controlled guidance run shrank. That doesn't mean the threat vanished overnight. It means the weapon's impact became spikier, dangerous in the right conditions, blunted in the wrong ones. Now we reach the turning point of the whole story, and it's not a single battle. It's a shift in confidence. The turning point came when Allied commanders stopped treating guided bombs as an unknown terror and began treating them as a known risk with a checklist. Anticipate the attack profile. Activate countermeasures early. Maintain tighter fighter coordination. Prioritize the launch aircraft. And manage convoy maneuver so you don't self-inflict chaos. This changed outcomes even when the enemy still had the weapon. A guided weapon that arrives into a prepared defense is not the same as a guided weapon arriving into disbelief. And it changed planning. Invasion preparations could proceed with fewer pauses. Escort groups could resume more aggressive posture. Convoys could be routed with better understanding of where they needed air cover most. Rehook, the real victory wasn't, we stopped every missile. It was, we stopped the missile from stopping us. So what did the HS-293 ultimately achieve? It proved, in combat, that precision anti-ship strike was feasible with World War II technology. A guided weapon could be fielded, crews could use it, and ships could be sunk by something other than luck and mass bombing. That is a meaningful milestone in the history of warfare, one that points toward post-war missile development. But it also proved something equally important. Precision does not exist in isolation. Precision needs a supportive environment, stable guidance, survivable launch platforms, and enough operational freedom to repeat the tactic until it becomes routine. The Allies attacked that environment. They didn't need to invent a perfect shield. They needed to deny repeatability. Once jamming and fighter cover improved, the HS-293 had fewer clean opportunities. And without repeatability, even a sophisticated weapon becomes a special event rather than a strategic lever. In the aftermath, the legacy becomes clearer. The HS-293 wasn't a war winner, but it was a warning shot across the future. It foreshadowed a world where ships would be threatened by guided munitions launched from beyond gun range, and where electronics would be as decisive as armor plate. It also delivered a lesson in how militaries adapt under pressure. Identify the kill chain, find the weakest link, then build a layered response so the enemy can't fix the problem with one adjustment. Final payoff. In 1943, the HS-293 created a brief moment where the sea felt newly vulnerable and where a handful of guided strikes could reshape naval behavior. By 1944, that moment had narrowed, not because the weapon was a myth, but because the Allies learned to fight the system behind it. The weapon's deadly reality was never in doubt. Its hidden limits were revealed when the defender learned where to push. CD, story-based 2 to 4 sentences. If there's one takeaway from the HS-293, it's that the decisive target wasn't always the missile, it was the link that made it smart. If that kind of hidden turning point interests you, hit like, share this episode with a fellow history fan, subscribe, and turn on bell notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. Comment prompt. Which mattered more here, electronic countermeasures, fighter cover, or convoy tactics?